The town of Derbone Ridge lay sprawled beneath a pitiless sun, its streets cracked and bleached by years of heat that stripped color from the land. The crooked sign over the saloon creaked in a wind too hot to cool, carrying dust that bit into skin and eyes. Tumbleweeds skittered across empty thoroughfares where only the most desperate lingered. The buildings, faded and warped, leaned together like old men too stubborn to fall. Shuttered windows stared out like dead eyes, their curtains yellowed and ragged. Dust devils whipped through the alleys, lifting scraps of brittle paper and the sour stink of sweat and rot. Behind the saloon, in the dirt-streaked yard where nothing good ever happened, a makeshift auction corral squatted like a wound on the earth. The fence was patched with mismatched planks and rusted iron scraps. Its gate hung off one hinge. Inside, horses too starved to whinny and oxen with ribs like old branches waited their turn. Broken tools, faded quilts, and splintered crates of spoiled fruit lay strewn on the ground. A bleached skull hung from a nail, turning slow in the thick air. In the center of it all stood a great wire cage, fashioned hastily from fencing meant for pigs or chickens. Inside crouched a girl no older than 15. Her hair was a tangled snarl of dark strands matted with sweat and dust, her face smeared with grime. Bare feet blistered from the heat of the packed earth beneath her. Around her fluttered half a dozen pigeons, their feathers ragged, eyes dull with thirst. Some lay motionless, their frail chests stilled. The girl held one of the dead birds cradled against her chest, thin fingers moving through its matted feathers as though it were still alive. The auction crowd was thick with the kind of men drawn to misery like flies to a carcass. Drifters, gamblers, broken ranch hands. Their faces were hard, their laughter sharp and mean. They gathered close now, jeering, calling out names for her like dust liquor, bird bait, and cage rat. At the heart of them stood Clem Tarot, a brute of a man with a mouth full of yellow teeth and eyes like river stones. He wore a black hat slick with old sweat and a leather vest heavy with the weight of other people's lives. His badge wasn't official, but no one dared question it. Clem ruled Derbone Ridge like a buzzard over a carcass, and the men around him hung on his words. "Look at her," Clem crowed, waving a hand toward the cage. "Half-feral thing, ain't she? Found her picking scraps off dead birds. Might fetch a coin for some old trapper needing a cook, or a snake oil preacher looking to save a lost soul." His men howled with laughter, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. One of them tossed a flat stone at the cage, making the pigeons flutter in what little space they had. The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes, pale and wide in her dirt-smeared face, stayed fixed ahead, empty but for a stubborn flicker that refused to go out. An old man leaning against a cracked barrel mumbled something no one caught. His beard was more whiskey than hair, and his skin hung loose on his bones. "Man once stood up to Clem's daddy," he rasped, voice snagging like a thorn on old wounds. "Went by Crow. Ain't no one seen him since." "Shut up, you old coot," one of Clem's men barked, kicking the barrel out from under him. The drunk sagged to the ground, chuckling, a dry rattling sound like wind through dead leaves. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a voice that scraped the ear, clambered onto a crate and hollered for attention. "All right now. Next up's this here pigeon girl, fresh catch. No name, no kin, no owner. $1 to start." The crowd roared with cruel amusement. Some raised coins, others spat out half-hearted bids. The pigeons beat useless wings against the bars, their feathers clinging to the wire like scraps of dirty paper. And then the stranger spoke. No one had noticed him before. He leaned against a warped post at the edge of the yard, the brim of his hat pulled low, his face shadowed. Dust clung to his coat like a second skin, and a length of old rope hung coiled at his hip alongside a battered colt. He hadn't moved when the jeer started, nor when the girl's cage was dragged out. He stood as if he belonged to the land itself, weathered and still. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a low, dry tone that slid through the crowd like a knife between ribs. "I'll take her." The yard fell silent. Even the pigeons seemed to hush. Clem straightened, a sneer curling his lip. "What's that you say, stranger?" The man didn't lift his head. "You heard me." Murmurs swept through the crowd, eyes darting between the stranger and Clem. The tension thickened. heavy as a storm building over dry ground. A couple of Clem's men shifted their weight, hands drifting to holsters. The auctioneer hesitated, licking cracked lips. "Well, a $1 then. Sold to the man in the hat." A dry chuckle rose from the drunk at the barrel, followed by a string of wheezing coughs. The stranger stepped away from the post, dropping a pair of silver dollars into the auctioneer's hand. The coins gleamed briefly in the sickly light. He crossed the yard to the cage without hurry, his boots raising small clouds of dust. Clem watched him, the look in his eyes gone from amusement to something colder. The stranger knelt, unlatched the cage, and held out a calloused hand. The girl stared at it as if it were a trick. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, slow and unsteady, she reached out and took it. And just like that, the bidding was over. The old silver dollars clinked against the auctioneer's palm, their shine dulled by age, but heavy with meaning. The stranger dropped them without a word, his face still hidden beneath the broad brim of his hat. Around them, Clem's men exchanged sneers and half-laughed mutterings, but none of them moved to stop him. There was something in the way the man carried himself, a weight to his silence that spoke louder than bluster. Clem's gaze stayed locked on the stranger, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of something old and unpleasant tightening the corners of his mouth. The girl, crouched inside the cage, didn't speak. She watched the man through strands of tangled hair, her face a map of bruises and grime. Her lips were cracked, bloodless, and her eyes, pale as stormlit skies, betrayed a mix of disbelief and raw suspicion. The dead pigeon still hung limp in her grasp, feathers dirty and askew. When the stranger crouched before the cage and pulled the latch open, she flinched as though expecting a fist. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the man reached into his coat and drew out a canteen, unscrewing the cap and holding it out. The girl's gaze darted between him and the water. The crowd watched, not speaking, the silence tight as a noose. Dust floated in the still air, painted gold by the lowering sun. Slowly, she edged forward, every movement wary as a coyote around a snare. When her fingers brushed the canteen, she snatched it to her chest like it might vanish. The water spilled over her lips, running down her chin and soaking the filthy collar of her dress. She coughed once, but didn't stop drinking. The stranger set a rolled blanket by the cage's opening. She eyed it the same way she had the water. He didn't speak, didn't prod her, just waited. A voice broke the hush. "Well, look at you," Clem drawled, stepping closer, a crooked grin splitting his face. His men shuffled to flank him, hands hovering near holsters. "Never took you for the charitable type, stranger. Wasting good coin on a broken thing. Ain't worth the bullet it'll take to put her down when she turns." The stranger stood, dust brushing from his long coat. His shadow stretched long in the dying light. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, cutting through the heat and dust like a cool wind no one expected. "She'll fly free from now on." Laughter rippled through the outlaws, mean and sharp, but it thinned when Clem didn't join in. His smile flickered, something tightening behind his eyes. There was a name on the tip of his tongue, but he swallowed it. In the distance, the last of the day's light bled against the canyon walls, painting them a violent red. The horizon shimmered in the heat, but even in the haze, the girl could see a few pigeons taking flight from the old water tower, their wings catching the light like torn silk. She followed their ascent with her eyes, her fingers tightening around the dead bird in her lap. Behind them, someone muttered to a neighbor, words too soft to carry far, but clear enough. "Ryder came down from the north last night, crossed Hollow Ridge alone. Ain't nobody done that since Crow vanished." "Old ghost stories," another replied, though his voice wavered. The stranger turned back to the girl. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. There was nothing else to say. She crawled from the cage, every step a struggle, her limbs stiff from confinement. The stranger held out a hand. She stared at it, remembering every rough grip, every blow, every lie from men who had reached for her before. But this one made no move to force her. No pull, no bark command. It hung there, solid and steady, as though she could take it or leave it. At last, she reached out. The man nodded once, then pulled something from his pocket. A small object, carved from bone or maybe driftwood, shaped like a bird with its wings outspread. A whistle. He rolled it between his fingers before slipping it back into his coat. The girl watched the motion, puzzled, a question rising in her throat, but too dry and ragged to voice. They left the yard together, the stranger leading, the girl keeping a half-step behind, clutching the blanket tight around her shoulders. The crowd parted before them like water from a stone, eyes averted, whispers trailing in their wake. Clem stood rooted, his face tight, watching them until they passed beyond the fence and into the street. His jaw worked, and his hand brushed the grip of his pistol, but he didn't draw. Before sundown, he muttered under his breath. I'll have him both before sundown. The wind rose as they stepped out onto the main road, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and old blood. Overhead, the last of the pigeons vanished into the blazing sky. Hollow Gorge was a place the maps forgot, a tangle of broken cliffs and narrow canyons where even the bravest riders left no sign behind. The trees that clung to its rock walls were old, twisted things, their gnarled limbs heavy with moss and secrets. The wind moved through the chasms like a voice, carrying the yip of coyotes and the distant, mournful call of night birds. Moonlight washed over the land in cold streaks, painting the dry creek beds and wagon trails with a pale, ghostly glow. Bones lay scattered in the gullies, deer, cattle, men, long picked clean by scavengers and sun. The stranger led the girl through a narrow cut in the rocks, a trail barely wide enough for a horse to pass. The ground here was soft with dust, thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. They moved without speaking. She clutched the blanket tighter around her thin frame, the memory of Derbone Ridge and its hateful men still clinging to her skin. At a bend where an old, toppled wagon lay half buried, they made camp. The stranger knelt beside a low patch of stone and coaxed a small, careful fire to life. Its light barely reached beyond their feet. He checked the old rifle that lay across his lap, running a cloth along its barrel, eyes never lifting to hers. She sat nearby, her knees drawn to her chest, staring into the flicker of flame. The dead pigeon was gone, buried back along the trail, though she still felt its phantom weight in her hands. After a long time, her voice, rough from silence, scraped the night air. I had a place once, she said. A little ranch. Mama died sick, and Pa, he got taken by a dry creek flash flood. I was 12. She rubbed at her eyes with a dirty knuckle. Neighbor folks said they'd watch me, but soon as the law turned its back, they sold me off, passed me from hand to hand like a sack of grain. $1 here, $2 there. Ain't been no name for me in near 3 years. The stranger didn't answer. He worked a strip of leather through the rifle sling, testing its strength. His silence wasn't cruel. It was the sort of man wore when his own stories were better left buried. The girl felt it and didn't press. The fire cracked, the only reply to her words. Somewhere down the gorge, a coyote's howl shivered through the night. It was answered by another, closer this time. The stranger's head tilted slightly. He pulled a length of wire from his saddlebag, hands working swift and sure as he set a snare near the path they'd used. They'll come tonight, he said at last, voice low. Dust doesn't lie. The girl swallowed hard. Clem, his kind don't let go. Not easy. He showed her how to scatter pine needles over their trail, how to brush dust with a switch to hide tracks, and where to step where stone would leave no print. She watched, quick to learn, though her legs trembled from exhaustion. When she faltered, he said nothing, just waited for her to catch up. A soundless whistle left his lips, a note too high for human ears. Moments later, the dark shape of a hawk descended from the cliffs, wings stretched wide, landing on a low branch. Its feathers gleamed like hammered iron in the firelight. The girl gasped. Yours. The stranger fed the bird a strip of dried meat. Found him near dead years back. Learned to listen to each other. She studied him then, really looked. The dust, the scars, the old coat mended a dozen times. There was a weariness about him, but not weakness. A presence that clung to him, like shadow. You got a name? She asked. He poked at the fire with a stick. Once. A silence stretched long between them. Then, soft as if speaking to no one at all, he murmured. Some called me Jonas Crow. The name stirred something. She'd heard it before, in snatches of stories, traded by wagon drivers and saloon drunks. A bounty hunter who'd strung up men twice his size, who rode alone into outlaw camps and left no one breathing. A ghost with a 6-gun. Thought you was dead, she whispered. His mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Most folks did. The tension between them eased a notch, and when he told her a rough-edged story about a one-eyed mule that tricked a sheriff into locking himself in his own jailhouse, she laughed. A raw, half-broken thing, but it came from her gut. The sound surprised them both. Night thickened around them. The wind shifted. Jonas straightened. Horses, he muttered. They snuffed the fire. Jonas set the girl behind a boulder and handed her a length of rope. If one passes, trip him. Aim for the neck. She gripped it tight. The first of Clem's men came cautiously, leading their mounts. Jonas's traps sprang to life. A wire snare yanked a rider from his saddle, dropping him hard. A second stumbled into a pit between rocks, snapping his leg. Jonas moved like shadow, no wasted motion. His revolver barked twice, each shot clean and final. The girl held her rope tight as a third outlaw limped by. She jerked it hard, sending the man sprawling. Before he could shout, a rock in Jonas's hand struck his skull. By the time the last man turned to flee, the hawk dove from the darkness, talons raking his face. He screamed and staggered into a snare. The fight was done in moments. Jonas knelt by each man, placing something small on their chests, carved pigeon whistles, their pale shapes catching the moonlight. A mark, a message. Clem would know. The girl stood by him, breathing hard, her heart pounding so loud she was sure it would echo through the gorge. Was that all of him? She asked. For tonight? He looked up at the cliffs, then back to the girl. Get some rest, he said. We ride at first light. And as the coyotes howled again in the distance, she lay down beneath the stars for the first time in years, without a cage around her. Dawn came like a bleeding wound over Drabone Ridge, spilling red light across the hard-packed earth and brittle rooftops. The town lay uneasy in its own shadow, the streets still and hushed in a way that didn't feel natural. Folks peered from behind cracked shutters, faces pale and tight, while dogs slunk low to the ground. Word had run ahead of the rising sun. Clem Taro's men were missing, gone into Hollow Gorge and never come back. Jonas Crow rode down the main street like a man trailing his own legend, the girl seated behind him, thin arms wrapped tight around his waist. Dust curled off the hooves of his horse, hanging in the cool morning air. The pigeons, which had always scattered at Clem's approach, now circled above the church steeple, restless and waiting. The town felt brittle as old bone. Jonas reined in outside the saloon. The girl slid down first, feet hitting the dirt with a soft puff of dust. She could feel every eye on them, every breath held tight in chests. Someone stepped back into a doorway, the sound sharp in the hush. Jonas dismounted without hurry, tying his horse to the rail. He glanced at the girl. You don't have to see this. Her jaw set, bruises standing out like ghostly fingerprints on her face. I ain't hiding. They stepped together toward the saloon. The girl pushed open the lopsided batwing doors, her shoulders squared, though her hands trembled. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and spilled whiskey. A handful of men scattered at the sight of them. The bartender went stock still, eyes dropping to the floor. Clem Taro stepped out from the back room like a snake from tall grass. His hat was pulled low, and a fresh pistol hung loose in his grip. His face was pale, sweat beading along his hairline despite the morning chill. You, he muttered, staring at Jonas as if seeing a ghost. You're Crow, the crow who strung up my paw over that cattle run in Elkhorn. Jonas didn't blink. And I'll clip your wings too, Clem. A breath passed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once. Clem's men were already shifting, hands inching toward iron. Jonas's revolver cleared leather in a blink. The first shot split the air like a whip crack. The second followed so fast the echo hadn't settled. One man dropped where he stood. Another stumbled back, clutching his throat. The room exploded into noise and gunfire. Jonas moved through it like something made for killing. Each shot a clean, Precise thing. No waste, no flourish. Clem's men fell one by one, their pistols barely drawn before he cut them down. The girl dropped to her knees behind a table, heart hammering against her ribs. She saw a pistol slide across the floor, kicked loose from a dying man's grip. Another outlaw lunged toward Jonas's side, a shotgun raised. Without thinking, she snatched up the weapon. It felt heavier than it should, but her hand steadied. Her father's old lessons whispered in her bones, lead the target, never look away, squeeze, don't yank. She fired. The man's chest caved inward as the shot caught him square. He dropped without a sound. The room went still again, the stink of blood and powder thick as molasses. Jonas turned, his eyes meeting hers. Something passed between them then, not surprise, not shock. Recognition. Good, he muttered, nodding once. Clem made his move. Fast and ugly. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet missed Jonas by inches, smashing a glass bottle on the shelf. Jonas stepped forward, his revolver rising like it weighed nothing. Clem tried to fire again, but the hammer clicked empty. You're done, Jonas said, and shot Clem through the gut. Clem doubled over, blood soaking through his vest, mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry rock. Jonas walked up, placed the barrel against Clem's temple, and finished it without ceremony. No speeches, no warnings. A single shot. The sound of it echoed off the canyon walls beyond town. For a long moment, there was nothing but the buzz of flies already gathering. When Jonas holstered his pistol, the girl lowered the shotgun. The townsfolk began to emerge, wary at first, then bold as the weight of Clem's rule lifted from the air, like storm clouds breaking. Old Sam Hatcher crossed himself and spat. About damn time. Within an hour, men were tearing down Clem's crooked auction pens, pulling down nooses, smashing crates of bootleg whiskey. The brothel women left without a backward glance. The banker's clerk resigned before noon. Jonas stepped outside and made his way to the small patch of earth behind the church where the grass grew a little higher, the stones a little older. He knelt beside an unmarked grave and dug a small hole with his knife. One by one, he placed the pigeon whistles he'd left on the fallen outlaws into the earth, covering them with care. They ain't much, he said quietly, but it's something. The girl stood behind him, silent. You don't owe me nothing, he told her. I know. He rose, dusted off his coat, and started for his horse. The girl didn't follow at first. She stared down the empty street, at the sun climbing higher, at the pigeons wheeling above the church. Then she turned and walked after him. Jonas swung into the saddle, pausing when he saw her. Where you going, girl? She squared her shoulders. Ain't figured it yet, but it won't be back in no cage. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. He reached down, hauled her up behind him. You ride quiet, keep your eyes sharp. I already do. And together they rode out of Drebone Ridge, leaving behind broken wood, buried whistles, and a town finally learning to stand on its own legs. The pigeons followed them for a time, dark shapes against the clean morning sky. The high ridge above Drebone Ridge stretched out beneath a sky so wide it made a body feel small, even one as weathered as Jonas Crow. The wind ran through the tall grass, bending it in ripples like water. The world below lay quiet, the town a handful of rooftops and dirt streets in the distance, the scars of yesterday's reckoning already fading beneath the morning light. Jonas reined in his horse, the girl sitting behind him, her arms loose around his waist now, not clinging like before. She looked out over the land, eyes clearer than he'd yet seen them. The air smelled of sage and dry earth, and above them, the wind carried the sharp cry of birds. A flock of pigeons burst from a clump of scrub trees nearby, the same ragged lot once trapped in cages behind the saloon. Freed by townsfolk with unsteady hands and guilty hearts, they climbed into the sky, their wings catching the sun, turning pale gray to silver. The girl shaded her eyes and watched them, something deep in her chest pulling tight. The wind whipped at her hair and tattered dress, but she didn't flinch. Not anymore. Jonas let the silence hang between them a long while. Then he spoke, his voice rough as gravel but steady. You ain't bound to me, he said. You're free now. Can ride where you like. North's green this time of year. West's wide open. She didn't answer at first. Just watched those birds higher and higher, until they were nothing but specks against the endless blue. Finally she said, I ain't caged anymore. I'll fly with you a while. He looked at her then, and though his face didn't change much, something eased behind his eyes. He gave a slow nod and turned the horse toward the horizon. The wind rolled over the ridge, carrying dust, the scent of grass, and stories waiting to be told. Some say legends are forged in gun smoke and blood, in badges and gallows. But out here, it wasn't the lawmen or the gunmen folk remembered longest. It was the ones too stubborn to bow their heads, the ones who stood up when standing meant dying. And somewhere out there, a man with a bird-carved whistle rides the frontier with a girl they once called the Pigeon, though no one dares call her that now. They found her among dying pigeons in a cage, until a man said, *, she'll fly free from now on. *, and she did.